At this point, I think that we understand some of the core components of the world of Kubernetes. We understand what pods are, what deployments are, and how we can expose pods to the outside world through the use of basic services like the cluster IP service. In this section, we're going to start taking our previous application, so that multi-container app that was calculating Fibonacci values, and we're going to bring it into the world of Kubernetes. We've kind of already been going down that path with this simple K8s folder, right? We've been setting up our multi-client image a little bit and working around with it, but we're now going to start putting a concerted effort together to take that previous multi-container application we had put together and adopt it into a sort of Kubernetes architecture. Now I've got a diagram that's going to be a high-level overview of the general architecture that we're going to use. So everything that you see here is in a single node. We're going to first develop all this stuff locally. We're going to set up the entire application on our local Kubernetes cluster. After we get this all put together locally, we're then going to deploy it off to a service provider such as AWS or Google Cloud. When we deploy it out there, we will have the option to expand to multiple nodes. So we won't necessarily just be limited to one single virtual machine for all these different objects that we're going to create. But for right now, we're just going to kind of imagine that it's all sitting on one single node. Now this diagram is showing the general overall architecture that we're going to use for us moving our multi-container app into the world of Kubernetes. You'll notice that there are some very familiar pieces in here. So we've got the multi-client set of pods, all being managed by a deployment. We've got the multi-server, remember that's the Express API, being managed by a deployment. And then you'll notice that I've also added in Redis as a pod this time around, and Postgres as a pod this time around as well. So back on the multi-container deployment on Amazon Web Services, when we used Elastic Beanstalk, we delegated to these outside services provided by AWS to manage our Redis and Postgres needs. But now that we're moving over to Kubernetes, we're going to put these things together in a production environment ourselves, rather than relying upon some outside service to do it for us. The overall purpose of the app is going to stay the same, so it's still going to be all about calculating some Fibonacci values. I know it's kind of a silly example, but it works and it allows us to have a couple of different services that work together in a nice fashion. Now you will notice that inside this diagram, there are a couple of new terms as well. So for example, on the far left-hand side is something called an ingress service. You'll notice that rather than having the node ports on our deployment for multi-client that we had previously, we now have a cluster IP. And it looks like just about every deployment that we put together, with the exception of the multi-worker right here, has a cluster IP kind of somewhat attached to it. So of course, we're going to talk about what an ingress is and what a cluster IP is as well. The other new piece of terminology that you'll notice inside of here is something called a Postgres PVC. PVC stands for Persistent Volume Claim. And of course, we'll talk about what that means when we get to setting up our Postgres stuff as well. All right, so that's the idea. We're going to take our previous application and we're going to move it into the world of Kubernetes. Now here's the general series of steps that we're going to take. So in a development environment, we're going to first create a config file for every last thing that you just saw in that diagram. So we're going to have configuration files for the ingress service, for this cluster IP, for this cluster IP, for this one, and we're going to have config files for every single one of these deployments as well. And we'll also have a config file for this persistent volume claim thing down here too. So in total, we're talking about like 10 or 12 or something like that different config files. It is going to be a lot of typing, but we definitely are going to learn a lot about these configuration files along the way. Now, once we put together all these config files, we're then going to test everything out locally on Minikube. So we're going to make sure that everything works locally first, and we're going to use it as our development environment. We're going to be as kind of as confident as we possibly can that when we eventually push this up to a production environment, everything will work the way we expect. After that, we're going to build a GitHub and Travis deployment flow, very similar to the one we had done previously for both the single container and multi-container applications. But of course, there will be some edits to it to make sure that everything is set up for a Kubernetes deployment as opposed to the rather easy and straightforward Elastic Beanstalk we were doing before. And then, of course, the very last step is to make sure that we can actually deploy this entire thing to a cloud provider like AWS or Google Cloud. And yes, we're going to go through that entire series of steps together and make sure that people can actually visit our application in a meaningful way. All right, so we definitely have our work cut out for us, no two ways about it. So when we come back together in the next section, we're going to flip back over to our complex multi-container project, and we're going to start setting up config files for everything inside of here. So quick break, and I'll see you in just a minute.